Yesterday, the UAE's energy minister stepped up to a bank of microphones and delivered a sentence that deserves careful listening, not just for what it said, but for how it was phrased. He said, "The time has come to focus on what our national interest dictates." Then he announced that the United Arab Emirates, a founding participant in OPEC since 1967, back when the UAE wasn't even formally a country, would exit the organization effective Friday, 3 days from now. While he spoke, Tehran said absolutely nothing. No statement from Iran's foreign ministry, no commentary on state television, no official reaction at all. This, despite the fact that Iran has been targeting UAE-linked shipping and has enforced a closure of the Strait of Hormuz that has constrained Emirati oil exports. In fact, the UAE energy minister told CNN directly that the timing of the withdrawal made sense, because Hormuz is closed. And yet, Iran, one of OPEC's 5 founding members in 1960, offered not a single word about driving the cartel's third-largest producer out of the organization. Most coverage is treating this as 3 different stories. First, the institutional story. What does the UAE's departure mean for OPEC's internal coordination? Second, the Saudi story. Saudi Arabia now carries even more weight holding the group together. Third, the market story. Oil spiking past $100 per barrel within hours. 3 narratives, 3 expert panels, 3 separate analyses. But they're not separate. They're one story, and that story isn't really about OPEC's structure, or Saudi Arabia's burden, or even oil prices. It's about what Iran just accomplished, without resigning from OPEC, without issuing a statement, and about the Chinese-built system that made it possible. Let's start with the mechanism, because this is where most reporting misses the critical point. Iran didn't withdraw from OPEC. Iran hollowed it out from the inside. OPEC's basic purpose is simple. Members coordinate production levels to manage global oil prices. But that coordination only works if members can actually produce and export their oil. When one member uses force, closing Hormuz, striking shipping lanes, targeting port infrastructure to restrict another member's exports, the coordination mechanism collapses. The UAE has 4.8 million barrels per day of production capacity. That capacity is constrained right now because Iran has enforced a closure of Hormuz. The UAE's energy minister said so plainly, the exit's timing is appropriate because Hormuz is shut and market impact will therefore be limited. Read that carefully. The UAE is effectively saying, because Iran has blocked the route through which our oil flows, our OPEC membership currently offers us no value. Leaving now costs us nothing and gives us flexibility later. Iran made the UAE's membership functionally useless by choking the channel through which its oil reaches the market. Once that membership lost its utility, the UAE walked away. Iran didn't need to change OPEC's membership list. It just made OPEC irrelevant for one of its largest producers, and it stayed inside. There's no OPEC rulebook provision for this scenario, no clause that expels a member for shutting down a shared waterway, no enforcement mechanism. Iran remains seated alongside Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela, Libya, Nigeria, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, the Republic of Congo, and now presides over an organization that cannot function properly for its third largest producer. OPEC can't respond, and Iran understands that. Now consider what this means for the United States. Part of America's military objective in confronting Iran was to reopen Hormuz and stabilize global energy flows. The assumption behind that strategy was straightforward. Once the strait reopened, the existing energy architecture, OPEC coordination, Gulf export systems, long-standing market channels would be ready to absorb the restored supply. That assumption is no longer solid. As of May 1st, the UAE, currently at 4.8 million barrels per day and aiming for 5 million by 2027, will operate outside OPEC. Non-OPEC producers aren't bound by quota discipline. They produce as much as they can and let market forces determine price. When Hormuz reopens, Emirati barrels may return to market without OPEC coordination. That unrestrained supply will interact with global demand in ways the old OPEC structure was designed to smooth out. The war meant to stabilize the system may be reshaping it into something less coordinated and less predictable. The treatment is splintering the patient. There's another layer here. For decades, American politicians criticized OPEC as a price-fixing cartel. President Trump openly called it a group that inflated oil prices at consumers' expense. The rhetorical stance was consistent. OPEC bad, freer markets better. But Washington never used force to dismantle OPEC. Gulf allies were inside it. Strategic relationships mattered. Now, through unintended consequences, OPEC is weakening anyway. Iran's Hormuz closure, enabled by a maritime shadow network China helped build, has undercut OPEC's coordinating function for the UAE and potentially for others. The outcome the U.S. long complained about, a diminished OPEC, is unfolding not by design, but through conflict. At significant cost, $18 billion in military expenditure, roughly a third of America's Tomahawk inventory used, 13 service members killed, and oil volatility feeding global inflation. The organization Washington disliked is being fractured by Tehran. The infrastructure that allows Tehran to weather that fracture was constructed by Beijing, and the United States is bearing the cost without controlling the results. So here's the central question. How does a country bombed for 60 days, blockaded at its ports, its supreme leader killed on day one, how does that country sit inside an oil cartel it is actively undermining and say nothing? The answer is one word: China. Not China as a diplomat in OPEC meetings, but China as an economic architect. Before this war, Iran's OPEC quota represented its official claim on global oil markets. That quota mattered when Iran relied on dollar payments, insured shipping, documented cargoes, and the SWIFT financial system. The moment China constructed an alternative network, that quota became symbolic. Through a so-called dark fleet, ship-to-ship transfers in Southeast Asian waters, relabeled cargoes, yuan-denominated payments processed through smaller Chinese banks with no exposure to U.S. correspondent banking, China created a parallel channel. Here's how it works. Iranian crude leaves port on sanctioned tankers with transponders turned off. At sea near Malaysia, Indonesia, or Oman, the oil is transferred mid-water to shadow vessels whose ownership is buried under layers of shell companies. Those ships then sail to China, where the oil is recorded as Malaysian or Indonesian crude. Chinese customs data shows zero imports from Iran. Yet, Malaysian crude imports run around 1.3 million barrels per day, more than double Malaysia's entire production. The math only works if the oil originates elsewhere. Payments move in yuan, outside SWIFT, through banks insulated from U.S. sanctions reach. During the most intense weeks of conflict, with Hormuz largely closed and American strikes ongoing, Iran exported 1.84 million barrels per day. That's more than before the war. Iran's exports are not dependent on OPEC coordination. They are sustained by China's alternative system. That's why Iran can remain silent as OPEC fractures. Its economic lifeline doesn't run through OPEC anymore. Now turn to Saudi Arabia. With the UAE gone, Saudi becomes OPEC's uncontested center of gravity, not because it grew stronger, but because a key counterweight left. The UAE had pushed for higher production quotas. That internal debate gave Saudi Arabia leverage in managing other members who preferred tighter output. That voice is now absent. Saudi Arabia also inherits a diplomatic strain. The UAE had credibility with Russia in the OPEC Plus framework, with the US in bilateral energy talks, and with Asian buyers in long-term contracts. That bandwidth shrinks with Abu Dhabi's departure. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia remains inside an organization alongside Iran, the same Iran whose Hormuz closure is restricting Saudi exports, since Saudi oil also transits the strait. There is no OPEC rule to remove a founding member for shutting the waterway, no escape clause for this contradiction. Reports suggest Saudi Arabia has urged Washington to reconsider its blockade posture, fearing retaliation against shipping lanes. That means Riyadh is balancing three pressures at once, coordinating with Iran inside OPEC, engaging Washington outside it, and absorbing market disruption caused by Hormuz. The UAE's exit makes that tension more visible. Is Saudi next? That's not speculation, it's structural. How long can the kingdom remain in an organization where one member uses force in ways that constrain the others? The UAE's minister insisted the departure wasn't about any brothers or friends. Diplomacy requires that language, but the enabling condition, Hormuz closed by a fellow member, remains. At some point, calculation may override cohesion. Let's acknowledge the counterargument. The UAE has been frustrated with OPEC quotas for years. It aims to raise capacity to 5 million barrels per day by 2027. Competition with Saudi Arabia for investment and regional influence predates this war. Commercial logic alone could explain the exit. Iran's closure of Hormuz, in this view, was defensive, collateral damage to OPEC rather than strategy. China's shadow fleet, likewise, was built to evade sanctions, not to replace OPEC permanently. All fair points. But here's what that interpretation can't dismiss. The UAE energy minister said the timing was right because Hormuz is closed. Commercial frustration created the willingness. The war created the opportunity. Iran's action created the moment. Without that closure, the exit likely doesn't happen now. And Iran said nothing. A country invested in OPEC's long-term viability would respond when its actions drive out the third largest producer. Silence signals something else. As Friday approaches, watch three things. First, whether any Gulf OPEC member publicly links the UAE exit to Hormuz. Explicitly naming that connection would signal internal recalculation. Second, watch Fujairah. The UAE has a pipeline bypassing Hormuz capable of moving 1.5 million barrels per day. If tanker traffic there rises after May 1st, the exit is being monetized immediately. Third, watch Beijing. As the world's largest oil importer, China benefits from predictable pricing. If it publicly supports OPEC cohesion, it wants stability. If it stays quiet, fragmentation may suit its position. Put four facts together. The UAE leaves, citing Hormuz's closure. Iran exports 1.84 million barrels per day during peak conflict. China reports zero Iranian imports while importing implausible volumes of Malaysian crude. And Iran remains silent as OPEC weakens. Iran has been inside OPEC since 1960. 66 years as a founding voice. In 60 days of war, it rendered the organization irrelevant for its third largest producer, stayed in its seat, said nothing, and increased its own exports. The cartel America criticized for decades is being undone from within. Iran pulled the lever, China built the machinery, and the consequences are only beginning to unfold.